Yeah, thank you for everyone who is already here and eager to listen. My name is Carleigh Morgan. I'm a final year PhD candidate at the Center for Film and Screen, and I'm one of the volunteers working with Cambridge Reproduction this year to organize this Early Researchers Seminar series. This is part of the Early Researchers Seminar series that is hosted by Cambridge Reproduction, and we would like to extend our gratitude and our thanks to all of the other volunteer coordinators who are organizing this series, and of course to all of the speakers who have agreed to take part, especially the speakers who are joining us today. So just a brief introduction to the speaker series and to Cambridge Reproduction more broadly. The seminars are held online on the first Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. This is the last seminar series of 2022, but we will be starting again in January, and we'd love to have more speakers for next year. So if you're a postgraduate student or a postdoc in Cambridge and you would like to take part in this Early Researchers Seminar series, please follow the link in the Cambridge Reproduction website or the link that will be dropped into the chat. So to offer a reminder and a brief description of what Cambridge Reproduction is, Cambridge Reproduction is an interdisciplinary initiative that brings together researchers from across the university who have an interest in any aspect of reproduction, everything from science, technology, and medicine to arts and humanities. Membership is open to all staff and postgraduate students, and it gets you access to all of our events, funding schemes, and our regular newsletters, which have research highlights, events, and opportunities in reproduction research. And speaking from personal experience, Christina does a phenomenal job coordinating and sending out all of these opportunities, events, and the latest news, so I highly recommend subscribing. To join us, just download the membership form from our website and send it on to Christina, the Cambridge Reproduction Coordinator. And again, there will be a link for this in the chat. So just to offer an overview of how today's session will run, there will be two 20-minute presentations from our speakers, followed by a lightly moderated Q&A, and I'm sure that all of you are experts and eminently familiar with how this works, but we'd ask that you either use the hand raise function in Zoom and I can call on you and you can pose your question that way, or you're welcome to post your question in the chat and I can raise that to the speakers that way. And we will now turn our attention towards Bosiljka Milosavljevic, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Psychology at Cambridge, and she works on brain imaging for global health, aka the BRIGHT project. BRIGHT is a prospective longitudinal study that has been following infants in the Gambia from the antenatal period to early childhood. And Bosiljka's focus within the study is to investigate the contribution of psychosocial factors, such as the caregiving environment and maternal well-being, on cognitive and neurodevelopment of children in the Gambia. And she will be delivering a talk today entitled Predictors and Longitudinal Trajectories of Perinatal Mental Health in a Rural Area of the Gambia. So please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. As has been told, I work on the Brain Imaging for Global Health, or BRIGHT project, which is a study of child development from sort of the third trimester of pregnancy all the way to preschool age, when children are aged about 3 to 5 years old. But today I'm only going to be talking about the sort of measures that we're doing with the mothers in the study and looking at mental health from pregnancy and during the first 2 years of the child's life. So when I talk about perinatal mental health, that can mean quite a lot of different things. People tend to typically think of depression, but really it can also be things like anxiety, bipolar disorder, even psychosis. But the key is that it's something that develops during pregnancy or sort of within 1 year after the birth of the child. And it's a very important thing to study because it has important consequences for birth outcomes. It's been associated with premature birth and difficult labor, and then subsequently both maternal and child well-being. And it's also been reported that certain perinatal mental health difficulties, and in particular depression, is the one that's been looked at the most, are reported to be higher among women that are living in low and middle income countries than in high income countries. So just to give you a bit of a statistic, in high income countries, the prevalence of depression is thought to be around 15%. And in low and middle income countries, that number is thought to be at around 25%. And this is really thought to be due to sort of women in low and middle income countries having more exposure to certain types of risk factors. And these are largely poverty related. So things like food insecurity, not having access to good medical services, but also psychosocial factors, higher prevalence of intimate partner violence, for example. So while this is something that has been looked at in a lot of different contextual settings, there are certain gaps in the literature when we're applying this to global mental health. And one of these is that most studies tend to focus just one single condition. So the most common one being perinatal depression. And sort of they'll look at how the prevalence of that one condition and how it relates to certain other factors. But there's really a gap in sort of studies that look at how, different conditions overlap with each other. And that's really important in our ability to then treat later outcomes. There's also a real lack of longitudinal research because sort of studies will tend to look at what's going on either during pregnancy or shortly after pregnancy, but we really don't know whether these higher rates of mental health difficulties or things like depression really continue long after birth, or if it's something that sort of occurs during pregnancy right after birth and then declines over time. And then obviously we need sort of to focus on more population-specific predictors as well. So just because something predicts poorer mental health in one context does not mean that the same predictor will apply in all other contexts. So just understanding what are different predictors in different societies will sort of help us better able to help women in different contexts. So the aims of the work that I'm going to be telling you about today are to measure the rates of maternal mood-related mental health difficulties during pregnancy among women in the rural area of the Gambia where we work. And when I say mood-related mental health difficulties, I am also largely focusing on depression, but also including anxiety and stress into that factor as well. And then to explore the trajectories of mental health difficulties during the sort of 2 years after the child is born, and looking at the impacts of context-relevant factors on mental health as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea about the study setting where we're working, so our study is taking place in the West Kiang region of the Gambia, which has a population of around 14,000 people. And a majority of the people here live below the poverty line, meaning that they earn less than $2 a day. And they rely primarily on subsistence farming, both for their food and income. And a lot of women in this community are subsistence farmers. And this is really quite sort of a stressful situation because their ability to farm varies greatly between the annual rainy and dry seasons. And sort of food resources start to get depleted during the dry season. And undernutrition is very common, and also things like anemia. There's also a high prevalence of infectious disease. And just as a note, English is the official language in the Gambia, but 80% of the population speak a native language called Mandinka. And that's sort of the ethnic group that we recruited from and the language that our study is primarily working with. So this is just a picture of Canaba, the village that we're working in during the rainy season on the left and the dry season on the right, just to give you an idea of the very stark contrast of the two seasons, and also sort of how difficult it might be for a community that does farming in this setting. Okay, so moving on to the methods. So I've sort of summarized our entire study here, but I'm only focusing on a very small part of it today. So we recruit mothers when they're in their 3rd trimester of pregnancy, and that's when we first start measuring mental health. We're also looking at their physical health, anemia, and sort of a variety of socioeconomic factors. And then we start seeing the infant when they're about a week old, and then when they're 1, 5, 8, 12, 18, and 24 months old. And we've just finished a preschool aged visit when they were 3 to 5 years old. And we do a whole range of assessments with the mothers and the child looking at the child's cognitive development, neural development, and then also looking at maternal well-being during the course of this time, as well as sort of caregiving factors like parent-child interactions. So our study recruited 204 families, and at the antenatal visit, where most of the data I'm going to present today comes from, we had 166 of these mothers taking part. Gestational age of the infants was around 36 weeks, and the maternal age at infant birth was around 29 years, although the range is actually quite high. So we have mothers ranging from 18 to 44 years of age. And to measure mental health, we used self-report questionnaires. So we measured perinatal depression during pregnancy, and then subsequently when the infants were born at 1 month, 12 months, and 24 months. We also measured maternal stress at these time points. And then we used 2 measures of pregnancy anxiety. And this is done during pregnancy only because it's just specific to the pregnancy itself. But the reason for using 2 scales is because they sort of measure different elements of pregnancy anxiety. So the pregnancy-specific anxiety scale is a much sort of more emotion-focused anxiety scale, like thinking about, asking a mother when she thinks of her pregnancy, does she feel panic, fear, that type of thing? Whereas the pregnancy-related anxiety scale is a much more cognitive measure of anxiety. So, for example, when I think of my, I'm worried that how my child is developing, or I'm worried about, whether I will have an easy childbirth, that type of thing. So they do measure different elements of anxiety. And implementing these measures into the sort of rural Gambian context took quite a lot of work. So the first step was doing a linguistic translation, and this involved getting a panel of Mandinka speakers, and we have sort of local staff on the project who are working with us in the Gambia. So we first had an initial panel that involved 2 translators that translated the original measure from English to Mandinka. And they really sort of did their best to keep the concepts the same, but sort of try changing, idioms or medical terms that wouldn't make sense in the setting. And we kept most of the items except one of the depression ones that was asking about suicide, just because we thought that there was so much stigma around that, that most people would say no to that question. And we replaced it with something that sort of was more relevant in their setting. After the translation was done, it was translated from Mandinka back into English to try to check whether the translations made sense and if everything was the same. We went through a phase of piloting and reevaluating our questionnaires, just to ensure that they actually worked with the local community and that we were getting decent responses, that they made sense. And then in addition to these steps, when we had the final questionnaires done, we also had to make administrative adjustments. So literacy rates among women in this community are quite low. So most of these had to be administered as questionnaires rather than just, as interviews, rather than just self-report questionnaires that people could complete at home. And in addition to these, the predictors that I'm interested in looking at are both maternal and paternal education and their income. The reason I split these between mother and father rather than just looking at sort of things like household income is because looking at sort of the mother's income alone tells us a little bit about sort of her autonomy and how she spends her money as well. So that is quite relevant. Household size, which could be taken as a proxy for overcrowding, maternal anemia during pregnancy, and then experience of previous infant or child loss. So to get into some of the findings, these are the sort of reports of depression from pregnancy to 24 months of age. And the red line that you see on the number 10 indicates what would be the clinical cutoff. And for this scale, that's what's recognized. So as you can see, there are a couple of mothers who do score above clinical cutoff for depression, but there is quite substantial subclinical variation as well. And sort of the key significant difference here is that depression is highest during the antenatal period and then lower at every point subsequent to that. When we look at stress or perceived stress, there is no clinical cutoff for this scale, but again, there's quite substantial variation in the scores, and the patterns here are quite different. So mothers tend to report the most stress at 24 months of age, as opposed to during pregnancy. And I don't know, I sort of think that makes sense if you have a little toddler running around, that can contribute to stress more maybe than having a baby in the womb. And then finally, these are the two anxiety questionnaires. And again, a lot of mothers are saying no to most of these things, but there is some variation in scores as well. So then when I looked at associations with socioeconomic factors, the only two things that really came out here were that the more people in the household, the more self-reported stress and anxiety that we got from the mothers. And then lower maternal income was associated with higher stress as well. But paternal income and education were not associated with maternal mental health at all. Moving on to anemia. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea about what the prevalence of anemia is like in this community. And as you can see, we pretty much have a 50-50 split. So during this particular trimester of pregnancy, hemoglobin levels of about 11 would be a clinical cutoff for anemia. A lot of women who are not anemic are sort of very much at this cutoff. And there are several, but not very many women with sort of very severe anemia either. And sort of the reason why I thought it would be interesting to break it down in these two groups is because I wanted to look at the association between hemoglobin levels and mental health in anemic women and not anemic women separately, with the idea that, you know, if you're anemic, having more severe anemia would potentially relate to worse mental health, whereas if you have healthy iron levels, sort of having more iron in your blood doesn't necessarily contribute to better mental health. So that's what I was really interested in trying to find out. And with one of the measures, the pregnancy-specific anxiety scale, that did seem to be the case. So among anemic women, those who were more severely anemic reported higher levels of pregnancy-specific anxiety, whereas among non-anemic women, there was no association at all. And it was only in this scale, there were no other significant associations in any of the other measures. And then the final thing that I looked at was whether the mother had previously experienced the loss of an infant. So this could be an infant death after it was born, a stillbirth, or a miscarriage. And this is sadly a very common thing that women in this setting experience. So from our sample, approximately 1 out of 4 mothers had previously lost a child. I don't have like specific information about how that was. All I know is that it was due to one of these 3 causes. And among these as well, I also found that sort of a trend level association where mothers who had previously lost an infant sort of reported slightly higher pregnancy-specific anxiety than mothers who had never lost a child. Okay, so just to give you sort of a quick summary, overall, a few women reported sort of elevated mental health difficulties, but there was a lot of subclinical variation in the scores, which is good because it sort of shows us that not many women are sort of suffering with clinical mental health difficulties, but we do have a range, which is kind of what we would expect. Sort of the key socioeconomic predictors were household size and maternal income, whereas paternal factors did not contribute to maternal mental health. And I think that really suggests that, you know, like a woman being able to earn money, having a job, being able to decide how she spends her money does contribute to better mental health than just the overall amount of money that they have. And maternal anemia and previous child loss were related to elevated pregnancy-specific anxiety symptoms. So again, just a reminder that these were sort of the more emotion-based symptoms of anxiety rather than the more cognitive ones. And sort of the next steps that I'm going to take with this are to try and evaluate sort of the predictors of different mental health trajectories, right? So now I've kind of looked at predictors of mental health at one period of time, but what I'm really interested in seeing is, are there some women that score high during pregnancy and then sort of have high difficulties as they go on during the sort of child's 2 years of life, whereas others will tend to sort of have elevated symptoms and then go down. And I'm really interested in what differentiates sort of mental health in these two groups of women. And then the second thing is to sort of start examining how maternal mental health impacts on child development, their neural outcomes, parenting, and caregiving. So just have to say a huge thank you to all the families who took part in our study. The amazing study team, we're a huge study and there's a lot of us, but a big thank you to all of them. And thank you.